My name is Matt Bowker, and I work in the programming department at Rhodes Scholar. And it's my pleasure to host Rhodes Scholar's first virtual lecture series. Today, you will be hearing from Dr. Nettah Yoeli-Rimmer. Nettah is a postdoctoral research fellow at Ghent University in Belgium. He obtained a PhD in literary studies from Ghent University after earning his master's in European culture at the University of Cambridge. In addition to writing for a number of publications on architecture, urban history, literature, and language, Nettah has been leading Rhodes Scholar programs in Northern France for 10 years.
Thank you very much, Matt. And thank you also to Rhodes Scholar for inviting me to this lecture, which has the title, Secrets of Normandy, the Unexpected History of the French Vikings. So let us begin. And I'd like to begin by discussing a little bit my slightly cheeky title that I've chosen here, The Unexpected History of the French Vikings. I'm well aware that I'm being deliberately anachronistic with my use of the word both French and Vikings, as will become clear in just a moment. So our virtual journey today will take us to northern France, of course, to Normandy, but it will also take us further afield because we're following in the footsteps of these French Vikings. Our journey starts with this figure that you see here. This is a tomb that is in the Cathedral of Rouen in Normandy in northern France. This is the tomb of Rollo, who is our hero for this story today. He is the first French Viking, and his story will become clear in just a moment. To begin our story, we have to go back quite a long time, and we're going back really to the time when Europe was in upheaval and chaos after the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, let's think more or less about the year 410, which was the sack of Rome by the Visigoths, as a year that marked the defeat of this imperial world, this Roman world that pretty much dominated European life for centuries beforehand. At this time, which is what we call the Age of Migration, we had barbarian tribes coming from the north and from the east and displacing traditional ways of life across Europe. The Vikings were one of many such people who were coming down from the north and raiding consistently in the old towns around Europe. The Vikings, particularly, we think of them as seafarers, and of course they were to a large extent, but their main method of travel was navigating the river routes around Europe. And here in France, they arrived at the mouth of the river Seine, sailed up the Seine, and repeatedly sieged the city of Paris. Here we have a 9th century engraving of a siege of Paris in 845, for example. But this is only one of many such events that took place throughout the 9th century. Now, the Vikings, we think of them as violent, aggressive raiders, which is not entirely false, of course. I mean, the Vikings, for example, gave us the word that we have today, berserk. To go berserk, this comes from a class of Viking warriors called the berserkers, who used to wear shirts made with bear fur, often wolf fur as well, and they would be the kind of avant-garde of the Vikings who would go crazy and raid and frighten the people that they were attacking. But this is also a very unfair characterization of the Vikings. They were much more than just violent marauders and raiders. As we see here from a quotation from Stephen Ashby, who's a professor in Viking history at the University of York, which is of course a major Viking city in the north of England. And he tells us, examples of craftsmanship and technical tool work, and there are many more, demonstrate that the Vikings should be seen as more than just raiders and more than simple traders or merchants too. With their outward-looking society and cutting-edge techniques, they were among the earliest investors in global technologies in a post-Roman world that even then was increasingly international. Now, this raises a number of very important points for us today. Here we have some basic examples, the most famous ones perhaps, of Viking technology. Most important of all, the one I'm showing you here, is the Viking longship. This is what allowed them to travel such huge distances across oceans, seas, and rivers. And we have the Viking axe as well, which will come back later on in our story. But I also want to focus on this idea of global technologies and an international world, because I want to show you an image of the world that the Vikings created for themselves, and by extension for the whole of Europe, in the 8th and 9th and 10th centuries AD. What you can see here is the Vikings, this is their main point of origin, what is today Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, of course. These are their main trading routes. And you can see that they set up settlements in these areas that we see here that are shaded in lighter green. What is amazing is if you look at the river networks that they traveled along, they were trading far and wide all across Europe and beyond. Here we have the Viking term Miklagard, which translates as large town or large settlement, large city. This is, of course, Constantinople or Byzantium, which was the center of the Eastern Roman Empire that still existed in those days. They were trading down the Volga River, and they found themselves as far as Baghdad. We know that we have found huge amounts of Arabic coins in burial chambers in Denmark and Sweden. So we know that they were trading all the way down with the Arab world and with Constantinople. Not only that, but we know that the earliest Russian political entities, the sort of ancestors of today's Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, were Vikings as well. They were called the Varangians or the Rus, the Kievan Rus, particularly around the city of Kiev here. And these were the ancestors of modern day Russia. So they were hugely influential in their trading networks. We mustn't forget, of course, given that this is coming to us from a transatlantic link today, since I'm over here in Europe, the Vikings, I'm sorry to say, Christopher Columbus, they got there 492 years before you when they set up the first European colony in the New World in what is today Newfoundland, which they called Vinland, in the year 1000. So we have to give the Vikings more credit than what they are known for traditionally. We can think of them perhaps as a sort of proto-capitalists. Again, we're being a bit anachronistic here, but it might be a useful metaphor to think about how the Vikings operated. Anyway, to go back to what interests us today, which is France, of course, and the French Vikings, the story takes us to another one of these raids that took place in the year 911. Now, in 911, the king of what was then called West Francia, the ancestor state of modern-day France, this was a state ruled by the Carolingians, the Franks, as we call them, is what gave us the word France and French and so on. The king of the West Franks at that point was a man called Charles III, who was known as Charles the Simple. Now, he signed a treaty with our earlier hero, whose tomb we saw before, the Viking Hroflir. This is a statue of Hroflir, again in the city of Rouen. They signed a treaty called the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte in 911, by which Hroflir would be given a piece of land in France, in what was then Western Francia. In exchange for this piece of land, of which he would become a duke, he would have to A, be baptized as a Christian, very, very important for the further development, and also he would protect Paris and the rest of the French kingdom from incursions by his fellow Vikings from the north. So the year 911 marks a turning point in relations between the Franks and the Vikings, and it marks the birthplace of the Duchy of Normandy. And this is the coat of arms that you will still see today when we go to Normandy. These are the two lions that represent the Duchy of Normandy even today. And here we have a map that shows us the geographical outlines of the Duchy of Normandy as it was when it was founded in 911. Normandy, of course, the very name of the region in France, comes from the Norsemen. This is what Normandy means. It is the Norsemen, the Normands, the people from the north who have come here and set up this duchy. Now, I was telling you that I was being a bit cheeky when I referred to the idea of French Vikings. There are two questions we have to ask about this concept of French Vikings. First of all, how French were they? And secondly, how much of Viking culture persisted in this new state? Now, something that's very important is that they very quickly became French in the basic sense of the word, that they abandoned their own language and started to speak the local language, which was a langue d'oil. Now, langue d'oil is a family of languages in the north of France that are descendants, of course, of Latin. These are what came about when the Roman Empire collapsed and people lost touch with standard Latin spoken in Rome, and they started to speak a sort of incorrect, mistaken, misshapen Latin that became the precursor of modern day French. So the Vikings in Normandy very quickly abandoned their language and spoke the language of the people they conquered. It might sound strange, but it's actually not that unusual. This is what we call acculturation, and it happened all across Europe in this age of migrations that I'm talking about. So already the Franks themselves had been through the same process a couple of centuries earlier. We must remember the Franks were a Germanic people. They spoke a Germanic language that would later on become modern-day German, but they started speaking the Latin languages of France as well. So they became French in the sense that they were French-speaking, but they did maintain many aspects of their Viking traditions, one of which, as we'll see here by Richard II, who's a descendant of Rollo, they practiced what is called marriage more danico, and that is a sort of common law marriage by which they could have more than one wife. So Richard II had a wife that he married in the Latin rite, an official wedding ceremony called Judith, and then he had a common law wife, more danico, called Poppa. Another aspect of their culture that they maintained was the use of patronymics. So if you think about even today, people of Swedish, Norwegian heritage, they're called things like Johnson, Stevenson, etc. They maintained this and translated it into French and put it at the start of the name. So we ended up with the idea of fils de, which became fils or Fitz, and that is where we get names like Fitzgerald, because when they invaded England, that I'll talk about in a moment, they took this type of name across with them. So if you have a name that begins with Fitz, you are probably descended from the Norman Vikings. They also left an extensive toponymy in Normandy itself, place names that reflect earlier Norse language use. So we'll have towns that end in Boeuf, Bec, Dal, Ville, which we will not see in the rest of France, for example. Now, anyone who speaks a little bit of French might think, ah, yes, but Boeuf, that refers to beef. It's a French word. It's a mistake. It is not actually related in any way to Boeuf, to beef. It actually comes from an old Norse word that has given us the English word today, booth or shed, and it implies an early basic settlement. You will see towns in England with the name by, Welby, Kirkby, etc., come from the same root. And the modern Danish word, for example, for a city is by, by. Beck is from a stream, a small river. Dal is a valley, like the Yorkshire Dales. And ville, this is a Latin word. It means town or city or farm or some sort of settlement. But what's interesting is that in Normandy, it comes after the adjective and not before. So you will get things like Neuville, new town, whereas in the south of France, you would have Villeneuve, reflecting a more Latin use, for example. Now, just a brief look, we won't go into we don't have enough time to go into everything, but have a look here at the family tree of the descendants of Rollo, and you will see that his great-great-grandson is a very famous figure called William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror began life as the Duke of Normandy in this castle right here in a town called Falaise, which means cliff, appropriately enough, in Normandy. And it is from Falaise that William set about planning his very, very famous invasion in 1066 across the English Channel to England, which then became part of the Duchy of Normandy. Here we have a piece of the very famous Bayeux tapestry, which of course, when we go on the program, we go and visit, and we learn that it is not a tapestry at all, but rather an embroidery. And in this embroidery here, we see William here in the middle, flanked by his two half-brothers, Odo, who was the Bishop of Bayeux, and Robert, who was a knight, a warrior, a brother of Odo. Odo was the one, incidentally, who we believe commissioned the tapestry in the first place, and that's how it ended up in Bayeux today. Now, when they came to England, they essentially founded a new kingdom. So Normandy, because of this agreement from 911, Normandy was nominally subject to the French kings. You know, they were vassals, the Dukes of Normandy, of the French kings. When they got to England, they became kings in their own right, and William had himself crowned in Westminster Abbey as King of England. Now, what you see here is the coat of arms of England, and it will look familiar, no doubt, because it's the two lions of Normandy with an extra lion for this new territory here. Now, today, the coat of arms of the United Kingdom, all the way in 2020, still contains, you will see the three lions, so still referencing the original two lions of Normandy, and you will see another addition that the Normans gave to England, which is the use of the French language. So here you have two important slogans of the United Kingdom, of the Crown of the UK, Honi soit qui mal y pense, which means basically, essentially, damn be he who thinks badly, and Dieu est mon droit, God and my right. Now, the Normans never fully abandoned their Viking traditions. Their thirst for conquest, for adventure, was never slaked. And at the same time that they were invading England and establishing this new kingdom, they were also setting their sights further afield in the Mediterranean. And around that time, they also made Sicily one of their key possessions. Now, when the Normans arrived in Sicily, they encountered a very, very fascinating island that was under the rule of the Arabs. It was the same Arabs that had crossed over to Spain in 711 and set up the Caliphate and then Emirates of Cordoba, Granada, etc. They did the same thing in Sicily. And the Normans found a hybrid culture, a mixture of Greek, Byzantine, Latin, Arabic, and then their own traditions that they brought with them. Now here, for example, we see a coin that was minted for the Normans. This is a Norman Sicilian coin. It's very hard to see in this image, but you'll have to trust me here, where you have the pointer right here. This is an inscription in Arabic. So we have a coin minted by descendants of Vikings from France, with Arabic inscriptions being minted in Sicily for use in trade in Sicily, southern Italy, and North Africa. Here you will see, from a very important building that they had built in Palermo, this is King Roger of Sicily, a Norman, a Viking, essentially, dressed and seated like an Arabic emir, using pictorial representations, traditions, aesthetic ideas from Arabic culture. So we have this interesting syncretism, this mixture of ideas and styles. Again, it reminds us of what they did about a century previously in Normandy in France, this process of acculturation. We know that Roger of Sicily learned and spoke Arabic. We know that Sicily became an important center of translation of texts from Greek, Latin, and Arabic, and French. And it was all because of this Norman appreciation for mixing. Now here we have another interesting quotation by Robert Bartlett, professor at the University of St. Andrews. And he tells us, and I quote, "The Normans simply disappeared. This might sound like failure, but in fact, it was the key to their success. They weren't interested in the purity of their blood. They came, they saw, they conquered, then they met the locals, learned the language, and assimilated themselves out of existence." So a very similar process to what we saw taking place in Normandy, in France itself. Now here we have an example of the building that this original mosaic that I showed you just before, here it is, comes from a wall of this building, the Cappella Palatina, that the Normans had built in Sicily in the 12th century. Now this is a fascinating structure because you see again the syncretism of styles. It's not that easy to appreciate in this image, but these are what we call Visigothic Arabic arches. These are the same arches that you will see all over Spain in the Muslim architecture, like in the famous Alhambra, for example. Like the Alhambra, this building also blends multiple cultural styles. So together with these Arabic arches, and if we could see the ceiling, you would see typical Muslim ceiling work here. We've mixed Byzantine mosaic traditions, like you will see in Orthodox churches in the former Eastern Empire, Constantinople, etc. Now, we've taken ourselves towards Sicily, but we want to come back to France, of course, because this is where we began our journey. Now, we come back to Rouen, where it all started, the very famous Cathedral of Rouen, that of course we visit thoroughly on this program. This is a picture of Rouen, well, I say picture, it's a painting, in fact, of the cathedral by none other than Claude Monet, who was fascinated by the Cathedral of Rouen and painted a series of over 30 paintings of this cathedral. So here you see a nice Monet-inspired version of the facade of this cathedral. Why have I come back to this cathedral? Because I want to show you something quite interesting and quite unique about the Cathedral of Rouen. Let's zoom in a little bit to the northern portal, the Portail Saint-Jean. This is the oldest part of the cathedral. Incidentally, this cathedral was quite heavily bombed in World War II, so we've lost quite a lot of heritage, unfortunately, but much of its beauty still remains standing. And in this portal here of St. John, I want to point out something quite interesting, which you don't expect to see on a Catholic cathedral. Can you see here the crescent moon of Islam? And this is again the Normans being inspired by all of their adventures overseas and picking and choosing elements and bringing them back with them as part of their journey. And then that gives us this unique circumstance of a Catholic cathedral in northern France with the inscriptions of half moons of the Islamic crescent that they picked up in Sicily. Now, what other remnants do we have of the Viking tradition in this region? Well, another town that we visit on this program is Honfleur. And in Honfleur, we have a very fascinating example of a wooden church. Now, this church was built during the 100 Years' War when materials were scarce, stone, of course, was very scarce, and so was labor. And this church was built to replace one that had been destroyed in the fighting. And it was not built by the normal craftsmen and architects who built cathedrals in the Middle Ages. It couldn't be because of the conflict that was taking place. Honfleur was blockaded, etc. It was built by the ship builders. And the ship builders of Honfleur, in the middle of Normandy, were continuing to build ships in the tradition of their Viking forebears, using only axes. They're called the maîtres des haches in French. They do not use saws at all. They simply use axes to shape the pillars. Here we see them here. Then look at the ceiling. It's exactly like an upturned hull of one of these Viking longships. So even in the 15th century, we still have this aesthetic architectural legacy of the Vikings taking place in Normandy. Now, what about the Duchy of Normandy today? So it's important to bear in mind that the Duchy of Normandy as a political entity was already absorbed fully into the French crown by the late 13th century. So it ceased to exist as a separate duchy, with a few exceptions throughout history. Obviously, things in France changed quite a lot. That's an understatement, but it's a country with a very turbulent past and turbulent history, obviously. But then after the French Revolution, Normandy completely ceased to exist even as a region. It was actually split in two, and you had Haute Normandy and Basse Normandy. But with the recent reform in 2016 of the French regions, Normandy has been reinstated as a full geographical region with very much the same borders and the same size as the original Duchy of Normandy that was set up in 911. But don't mourn the Duchy of Normandy yet, because it still exists today in a much reduced form, but it still exists. You might have heard of the island of Jersey. Now, Jersey, interestingly, betrays already its Viking heritage in its name, because EY, the ending here, is the Old Norse term for island. You will see it, for example, in the Orkney Islands off the coast of Scotland. You will see it in all the islands in Denmark and Sweden today that end in Samsø. It's the same root here, EY. And here we have a postage stamp that was made by Jersey to remind us of Roland, the Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror, links with France. And what I'm talking about, of course, are the Channel Islands, Guernsey, Jersey, and Alderney. You can see how close they are to the Norman coast of France. In English, we call them the Channel Islands, but in France, they are called the Îles Anglo-Normandes, which is a more accurate term that reflects their political history and their destiny. These were part of the Duchy of Normandy. Now, when the mainland part of Normandy was absorbed into the French crown, a treaty was signed with the kings of England that excluded these islands here. They remained part of the crown of England as the Duchy of Normandy. So it's important to bear in mind that these islands are not part of the United Kingdom. They are not part of England. They are not part of Scotland. They are separate territories that are in a union with the crown because they have the same monarch, but they are not part of the United Kingdom. They are actually the last surviving remnant of the Duchy of Normandy today. And so I present to you, ladies and gentlemen, the current living Duke of Normandy today. It is Queen Elizabeth II of England. She is a descendant, a direct descendant of William the Conqueror, and one of her titles is the Duke of Normandy. She reigns in the Channel Islands, not as the Queen, but as the Duke of Normandy. And when the inhabitants of the Channel Islands give their official toast to the Queen, they do not toast our Queen, they toast à la reine, to the Queen, notre duc, our Duke, because that is her title in the Channel Islands, which is the last piece today of this duchy that was founded in 911 by a very adventurous and very brave Viking from Norway, who made his way to France and became French. So there you go. That is our story of the secrets of Normandy and the French Vikings. Merci beaucoup, everyone, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Nettah.
You're very welcome. Do we have any questions, Matt?
We do have a few questions. Our first question asks, is there Viking influence in Paris, as that program looks like it begins in Paris that you're discussing?
Yes, that's a very good question. Is there Viking influence in Paris? The answer is that there is no Viking influence today that we can still see in Paris. There is a small plaque very close to where the first engraving that I showed you of the siege of Paris. There is obviously the whole city is transformed and we don't see anything like that anymore today. But near the Ile de la Cité, which was the island where the French were living when the Viking incursions were making their way up the river, there is a plaque that reminds us of the different sieges and what they did to the population of Paris, but there is no built legacy anymore of the Vikings today. Too much time has passed and the wooden buildings have not survived in Paris and many transformations have taken place. So there is no actual Viking heritage that we can see in Paris. No.
Okay, we have another question. The ship shown at the beginning was for a funeral, I believe. Was it ever a seafaring vessel?
Yes, I mean, the ship that I showed at the beginning is actually from a museum in Sweden, and it is exactly a ship that was used as a funeral. I don't know whether that particular ship was ever sailed or if it was built just for the funeral, but I know that they were the same ships that were sailed and that were used for funerals. They were exactly the same design and the same type of technology. I can't answer, unfortunately, about that particular ship.
Okay, beyond the language, are there any other cultural traditions in Normandy, Viking cultural traditions that have left their legacy?
To this current day?
Yep.
In architecture, very few, except for the higher tendency of wooden architecture that you find in Normandy compared to France. So this church that I showed is the largest example, the Église Sainte-Catherine. There are many smaller examples, which are similar to the stave churches you can find in Norway today. You know, it's that kind of use of wood. Other than that, no. I mean, it has been so long now that Normandy has been part of France that other than a sense of themselves as slightly different and an awareness of this Viking heritage, I can't say there's any actual cultural differences today that stem from the Vikings. Not anymore, no.
Okay, here we have one from Alice. What did the Vikings take back to their homeland from their experiences in France?
That's a very good question. What did the Vikings take back from the experience in France? What the Vikings were interested in from France, particularly in the early days, was grain. So what their original purpose there was to bring grain and corn and things like this back to the north. Once they became Normans and once they settled as part of the Duchy of Normandy, they actually didn't have very much contact anymore with their original home in the north. It kind of became a new center of their civilization, and they went from there to other places, and whatever they brought back from those places, they brought back to Normandy. That became their sort of center. They lost touch, it's fair to say, with Sweden, with Norway, with Denmark. They kind of disconnected from them by that point.
Okay. Are the Channel Islands, this is a question from Marie, are the Channel Islands included in Brexit, or do they remain in the European Union?
That's a fantastic question, because what's interesting is that they never were in the European Union. So even before Brexit, Channel Islands were not technically part of the European Union. They chose not to join when the UK joined in 1973. So their status will remain unchanged because they've never been members.
Okay. By the way, Kathy Davis says she traveled with you to Normandy in 2018. And as always, your inclusion of word origins is so interesting.
Thank you, Kathy. I remember traveling with you.
Okay, here's one from Viola. Many of the homes in French Canada extending down to northern Maine are shaped like ships. Is this due to the Viking influence of Normandy?
I don't have any expertise, unfortunately, to answer that question. I suspect not, because it was so much later by the time that there was a French colonization of Canada. It's more 16th century. That would be something I would have to look into, because I'm afraid I've never been to Canada and my knowledge of sort of Canadian vernacular architecture is very limited. So I don't know. But my kind of hunch would be that no.
Nettah, you need to be able to answer every question about every continent here.
Even on Canadian domestic architecture.
So we have a few questions about the Viking Museum in Oslo. Is there any exhibit on or anything about French Normandy in that museum?
I've been to that museum many years ago, and as far as I can remember, no, I don't think so. There are museums, however, about it in France, but in Oslo, in the museum, I can't remember anything specifically talking about Normandy, no.
Okay, here's one from John. What event caused the Vikings to start attacking parts of Europe?
That's a very interesting question that we could talk about for hours, but I will refrain from doing that. But essentially, so what I was talking about a little bit, there was a sort of sudden age in which people around Europe started to move. And there have been many, many different theories about what caused it. So some people prefer a kind of climactic theory, that there was a change in climate, that there was failed harvests. Some people speak about what they call the domino effect theory. So essentially, one group of people moves and displaces another group of people, and so on and so on. And you get this chain of movement. It's probably a combination of many of these factors. But essentially, the Vikings were either being pushed, there was maybe pressure from people who were coming from further east that were pushing them away, or possibly their harvests were failing and they were going out further and further south in search of places to live. Another possible theory is that the Vikings were actually a very successful culture, and therefore their population was growing. And so, like what happened with ancient Greece when they started to set up the first colonies, there was essentially an excess population in the coastal regions of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, and that pushed them to form these groups to go further out. So there's not really a single cause. There are many multiple causes that were part of this big chain of movements all across Europe for about 4 centuries, around the time of the collapse of Rome.
And just a few more questions. Did the Vikings reach anywhere to Northern Africa or the Middle East?
Yes, they absolutely did. That we know for certain. So first of all, what I didn't mention, because I was kind of concentrating more on France, is that when the Normans conquered Sicily, they also went further and conquered North Africa, the area that today would be Tunisia. That became part of a Norman territory of Sicily. But we know that the Vikings, they didn't conquer or set up colonies, but they were certainly in regular contact with the caliphates of Baghdad, with parts of the Silk Road in what would today be Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, the Khaganates of what we call the Central Asian steppes, and that they were doing through the river networks of Russia. They were sailing down the Volga and they were trading with merchants along the Silk Road. And that means they didn't ever get to China and India, but they would have certainly been trading goods that were coming from that far afield. So they were basically everywhere, actually, in the ancient world, that's for sure.
We have somebody inviting you to come to Canada to learn more about the Viking influence in Newfoundland.
That's very kind, and I would love to do that. Yeah.
We have Chris asking, I think you mentioned this before about the museums in Normandy. Are there museums in Normandy that focus on the Viking culture or influence? If so, where are they located, and do we visit them on any of these programs?
That is a very good question. There are quite a number of them. There is one in Caen and there is one in Rouen. We don't visit them on the program. So the program is actually more focused on particularly Impressionist art and also the World War II landings at the beaches in Normandy. And the Vikings is kind of a story that we weave in as we make our way through the program because it's kind of the foundation of Normandy, but we don't actually go and visit a museum specifically dedicated to that, no.
That concludes our webinar. So thanks again, everybody, and thanks again, Nettah.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Thanks very much, and take care.